How do you do your due diligence? How do you do the study on this? I mean, it's still for so many, it's a very complex thing to do.
You are absolutely right. So, I was mentioning earlier that reviewing the carbon footprint is an essential piece of our due diligence. It's not the only piece, but it's a very important piece because obviously we have Paris alignment commitments, etc. So, in that initiative, as we're trying to maximize our development impact, trying to maximize our climate finance capabilities, etc., across the world, we have to work with conglomerates. But then that comes with a complexity, exactly as you say, because conglomerates, especially the larger ones that work across countries, across sectors, across geographies, across jurisdictions, they have a web of different carbon data to play with. So I think the implication from our perspective is, well, what instrument do we use? And we have two kind of main instruments when it comes to debt financing. Either you do a corporate finance facility, so it means you're lending at the holding company level, and that holding company has a number of different subsectors, or you go a bit more micro, so you go project finance, which means that if you go with the latter, you're really ring-fencing your use of proceeds, and therefore the carbon data picture is drastically less complicated to work with. If it's corporate finance with a conglomerate, then it means the level of due diligence is a bit more involved. Mm-hmm. It means you have to go through the sustainability framework of the recipient of your financing, you ask loads of questions, and you do some materiality tests. And we have to do both types of financings because the big conglomerates have the ability to have an impact from a climate perspective. But at the same time, project finance with very specific use of proceeds is also something that we have to work with. So it really, from an investor perspective, it means that the level of due diligence is a bit more pronounced if you're going down the complicated conglomerate route. But we do this on a regular basis, and if ever the client doesn't necessarily have that framework, we can actually help them put that framework in place, as I said in my earlier intervention, Hussein.
All right. So one of the things that I've always tried to think about, we do have 3 scopes when it comes to carbon footprint. Scope 1, Scope 2, mainly they are company-specific. Scope 3, it is when you go through the value chain. And this is probably one of the most complex things to measure. And I think until now, so many companies are still struggling to find a framework for 3M, a conglomerate. How do you put the Scope 3 into perspective?
So thank you so much for your question. So for a very diversified company, we said earlier that we have 55,000 products, right? Reporting on Scope 3 has been voluntary. Mm-hmm. Done so far, but I have a news. We actually got our near-term target approved, and it will be published tomorrow. So we will have a commitment towards Scope 3, including our bit enhanced Scope 1 and Scope 2 commitment. I think one of the things that we have to understand is depending on the type of companies you are. So the way you will actually compute your Scope 3 will be complicated, and there's no one-size-fits-all. So we will have a hybrid approach to how we're going to compute it, because we have different products, and as BTI says themselves that, especially for companies such as ours who have intermediate products, it's very, very hard to actually measure how the products will be used downstream, right? So we have to kind of create a proper math and pass, which we have, but we cannot announce yet, and tomorrow it will be actually published properly. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The second thing is, what I wanted to say is, although we just got approved now, and we committed now, we have been very proactive. So we have started reporting on Scope 1 and Scope 2 in 2002, and at the onset of Scope 3, we were part of the piloting team that was actually kind of testing across 15 categories of how we can actually compute and calculate Scope 3 emission. So we didn't commit right away, but we did actually do our due diligence, and we did really work towards, kind of having a good formula to be able to actually commit what we're going to commit today. So that's pretty much it. And
Understood.
that is also the expectation of our stakeholder and our customers. So
And this
that's
is the
pretty
most
much
complex formula. Daxita, for you, do you follow similar framework or different perspective?
Well, as I mentioned, we do cover all three scopes. And yes, the most challenging is scope 3 across the value chain. But we started accounting for this, and it's part of our net zero strategy by 2045 as well, where we need to collaborate with our supply chain and our value chain. And so through this process, we mapped out our greatest suppliers in terms of spend and impact, and we started to engage with them and onboard them. So some of them have already got climate targets themselves, which made it easier. But those that are not, we simply, onboard them with climate questionnaires, what's their intentions, and what's their roadmap to achieve, be it net zero or meet certain global ambitions. So this was the starting point to really onboard the value chain. We do have a target for our suppliers. So it is by 2030 to have about 250 preferred suppliers, which is the biggest spend and the impact, to be either SBTi certified or aligned. And that really started with a climate questionnaire and onboarding them. We also embark the major suppliers, so for example, be it the wind turbine producers or the wind blade manufacturers or the solar panels, where we start to looking at how can we bring in circularity into the manufacturing process of those elements. So it is a starting point, and it is definitely a long journey towards that, but it does bring in a lot of challenges because you need to ensure all of them are onboarded onto this journey together.
I mean, given these challenges, Daxita, does it impact on the bottom line profits for the company when you have to have this rigid framework to follow?
Absolutely. I mean, when you're thinking about producing energy at a levelized cost of electricity, you have to ensure, firstly, energy security, energy affordability. So it definitely does have an impact, but then the question is, we're all working towards a common goal. And onboarding your suppliers early on ensures only it as being a marketing opportunity for them as well, to start integrating these policies at these stages. And so ensuring that, you addressing certain of those components with your suppliers, I think is important to also drive down any of the technology costs as you implement it.
So it's a long-term payoff. And
Absolutely.
Vivek, so you touched on the cloud and other things related to technology, but especially now when it comes to Scope 3, are tech providing any real solutions for Scope 3? Is AI helping? I don't know. You're the master of this.
Thanks, Hussein. I guess all of us really in this room or otherwise, we know that Scope 3 is the elephant in the room. But again, that all depends on the which part of the spectrum, which side of the spectrum you're viewing at Scope 3. And just vision this. If we cut across all industries over just x-axis and start looking from the businesses which are doing B2B and going from B2B to B2B to C, and then finally B2C. Now that's the spectrum by which increasingly the Scope 3 will go up. When you go towards more of processing, you go towards more of producing raw materials, your Scope 3 is not your biggest challenge. Scope 1 is the biggest challenge. You go more towards the consumer, your Scope 3 becomes more and more. Now here we are talking about what you're going into value chain, you're going into end use of products, you're eventually going to talk to thousands of stakeholders, and that's where Scope 3 becomes extremely complex. At Olive Gaea, we had been supporting multiple organizations, be it in banking sector, insurance, raw material, goods manufacturing, metals, services industry. And we had been really seeing the challenge around when the industry understands that I have big emission problems around Scope 3, but I don't have a complete control of my value chain. That's where cloud computing, that's where a platform which is helping you really do this whole automation of data analytics of data, categorization of data, and eventually throwing up real-time, forward-looking analytics around how your emissions is going to grow comes in handy. It actually comes in handy there. What we do very specifically when we come to scope 3 emissions, as we all understand that, there's a good amount of engagement that is needed beyond the business. You need to go to your value chain, you need to talk to your vendors. The tool actually automates this whole engagement. It makes it as easy that once your complete set of vendors onboarded, you would be able to visualize the complete emission associated with each of your vendor, how much percentage of your scope 3 is occupied against that particular vendor, and you can start evaluating sustainability performance of your vendors as such. This helps you really start focusing on how can you really tackle this whole puzzle around scope 3. And this does not just stop at your value chain emissions around your waste generation or probably upstream, downstream, capex or opex spend, but also goes beyond. The tool provides a complete support around financed emission, helping banks and the investment sector as such. So that's pretty much what we do.
Thank you, Vivek. Jean, let's get back to the IFC. And given the objectives of institutions like the IFC that aim to promote, they are promoting responsible investments, and especially in sustainable linked financing. So how do you ensure that the key performance indicators, what we call the KPIs, used are not only relevant, but they are also effectively driving decarbonization efforts across businesses that you are investing in?
So it's a very good question. Thanks for asking that, Hussein. So, I mean, probably a little bit of background for the audience. You know, in the world of sustainable finance, you have two types of instruments. You have your instruments that are looking at your use of proceeds, and you have your instruments that are looking at your targets, your KPIs. And these two instruments don't necessarily have to be linked. So in the example that you mentioned about sustainability-linked instruments, here you're looking at a corporate entity, and you're asking a question about what is their path to decarbonization. And how does sustainability-linked financing come into this? It's trying to link the recipient of our funding to any one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In most cases, you'll have one which is linked to greenhouse gas emissions, and a second one which is still part of the corporate scorecard of the entity. So what we have to do, we are quite careful about calibrating the KPIs, and it's a mutual exercise between ourselves and the clients. So we have to make sure that the KPIs are material, they're core, and they're relevant to the business. So if you're a telecom operator, you don't necessarily have a greenhouse gas emission as you would if you are an entity working in the energy space. So we take that into account. So there is that whole process I keep coming to, which is due diligence. We go through their framework, we look at the KPIs, we will get consultants to look at the KPIs that they have, and what do we do to increase, how can I say, the corporate agenda. So when we do a sustainability-linked instrument, we typically like to see clients going above and beyond what they have disclosed to the market. So if I have disclosed I'm going to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions by 10%, we're going to ask for a KPI that's more significant, so maybe 12%. So this is how we try to push the decarbonization agenda through KPIs that hopefully a corporate has put in place and made publicly available.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I think we're short in time, so let me get out of context a little bit and ask you how optimistic you are about the future. Miki, I mean, like, how optimistic that we are going to reach our targets when it comes to carbon footprints?
So that's a very good question. So the first thing that we have done in 2019, which is quite recent, is to have a sustainability value commitment to our products, right? So every new product, 100% of a product that comes out would actually have consideration around, you know, like your carbon emission, your environmental footprint. Also, what we do is we actually make sure that all the products that we have, or the maximum of the product that we have a life cycle assessment, which actually then in turn turn into environmental product declarations. And that can actually kind of help, customers to understand, what is the carbon footprint of the product that they're actually purchasing, right? And we actually discussed with Vivek earlier around how those can actually help us, one, the division and the business, understand how they can actually position their product, but also how we can actually improve our own carbon footprint by actually producing them, if it makes
Thank you.
sense. Yeah?
Daxita?
So I'm an optimist, and I think we're already begun the journey for climate action. We start to see it materialize through the energy transition by countries, private sectors, and non-state actors. So I think there is acceleration. Is it fast enough? That's always the question. And I think we will reach our targets by 2050, which is by mid-century. But the question is, are we doing enough? And I think this is a self-imposed question which we all need to ask ourselves. Are we doing enough? And so just based back to the thematic of this conversation is that if you have not started your Scope 3 accounting, I think start it, understand your status quo, and start engaging with your value chain suppliers. You'll be quite surprised that they're also equally eager to address this.
So the first thing is to start the action. Vivek, I went to your website yesterday, and I was surprised that I can even measure my own carbon footprints. Tell me just briefly about it, and how does it help as well from a broader perspective?
I guess this was one of the first few initiatives that at Olive Gaea we took. And that again brings back to the fact that we still believe in it, that collectively we can achieve it. And the unitary level stands at us as individuals. And that's where we want to create that larger awareness around your personal carbon footprint as a first place. What typically, and I would recommend, I would welcome you guys to go to the website and just check it out. Very quick few questions, and it throws a very, very accurate carbon emission of your whole family based on the sort of spending that you might be doing, the sort of food habits that you might carry, flying, travel, your basic stuff, right? Very basic questions. It helps you understand as a family what you stand at your carbon emissions. Also gives you recommendations around how can you really work around it, get it probably lower. As I believe that personally, that collectively, as individually, we start working towards those sustainable goals is where the final end goal we'll be able to achieve. So, thanks.
I would like to thank you for your valuable insights. I know that this is a very complex topic, but transparency and commitment is needed if you want to reach our targets. So thank you all for joining, and let's keep this conversation going. Thank you very much.